The tent stood empty for 3 days before anyone noticed the singing had stopped. Canvas walls billowed in the October wind, hymnal pages scattered across mud still marked by boot prints that led nowhere. Inside, a Bible lay open to Revelations, verse 6 underlined in what looked like charcoal, but tested later as something organic. The preacher's coat hung on the center pole, pockets heavy with creek stones. Outside, 17 chairs faced the pulpit in perfect rows, each seat bearing a small pile of wildflowers picked hours after the last witness claimed to have seen Reverend Silas Cord alive. The Watauga County sheriff would find no body, no blood, no signs of struggle, just that open Bible, those weighted pockets, and a sound that rolled down from the ridge every night for 6 weeks afterward. A man's voice singing hymns in a key that made dogs refuse to enter the hollow. Silas Cord stepped off the narrow-gauge railway at Banners Elk, North Carolina, on September 14, 1875, carrying a canvas tent, a leather satchel, and a reputation that preceded him by 2 weeks. The mountain air smelled of wood smoke and coming frost, the kind of cold that settles into bone before the calendar admits it. He was 38 years old, lean as hickory, with a voice witnesses later described as capable of filling a valley. The Baptist congregations from Boone to Blowing Rock had passed word along the ridgeline. A revival preacher was coming, trained at a seminary in Kentucky, gifted with the Holy Spirit, and willing to go where settled ministers would not. The mountain communities scattered across Watauga County existed in practical isolation, connected by footpaths too steep for wagons and suspicions too old to name. Church buildings were scarce. Preachers were scarcer. Cord rented a room at the Franklin House boarding house, paid for a week in advance with coins so new the innkeeper, Martha Gregg, held them to lamplight to check their authenticity. She noted in her ledger that he was polite, clean-shaven, and carried no liquor. His eyes were gray, she wrote later, the color of winter sky before snow. He spent 2 days in town, introducing himself to merchants and farmers who came down from the hills for supplies. He spoke plainly about his mission, to bring the gospel to remote settlements, to offer baptism and communion to families who had not seen ordained clergy in years. He asked no money up front, said he would rely on providence and hospitality. By the 3rd day, he had invitations to preach at 3 different hollows. He chose Raven Gap. The decision puzzled locals who knew the terrain. Raven Gap sat 7 miles northwest, accessible only by a trail that climbed through old-growth forest, where the canopy grew so thick that noon felt like dusk. The settlement consisted of 9 families, maybe 40 people total, descendants of Scots-Irish settlers who had pushed into these hills before the Revolution. They raised hogs, grew corn in clearings hacked from laurel thickets, and spoke a dialect that preserved words dead elsewhere for a century. More than that, Raven Gap had a history. 3 years earlier, a land dispute had turned violent. A surveyor named Polk had tried to enforce new boundary lines drawn up by timber companies eyeing the virgin chestnut stands. He was found in a ravine with a crushed skull, his instruments smashed. No one was charged. The families in Raven Gap claimed he had fallen, that the mountains were treacherous for outsiders who did not know the footing. Authorities in Boone let the matter drop. Some things, the thinking went, were not worth pursuing into those hills. Cord seemed unbothered by the warnings. On September 17th, he loaded his tent and provisions onto a mule borrowed from a livery and set out before dawn. Martha Gregg watched from the boarding house porch. She told investigators later that he sang as he walked, something about morning light and mercy, his voice carrying back down the road until the trees swallowed it whole. Raven Gap received word of the preachers coming through Jacob Hensley, the settlement's de facto elder, who had traveled to Banner's Elk the previous week and spoken with Cord personally. Hensley was 63, grandson of a militiaman who had fought at Kings Mountain, bearer of a family name that commanded respect throughout the high country. His word carried weight. He had been skeptical at first. Preachers passed through the mountains periodically, some sincere, others looking to collect offerings before disappearing. But Cord had impressed him. The man knew Scripture, could recite Paul's letters from memory, understood that mountain people judged worth by endurance rather than education. Hensley extended the invitation, and Cord accepted. The families in Raven Gap began preparations. Women cleaned the meeting ground, a natural clearing near the creek where baptisms had been performed since before anyone living could remember. Men cut fresh timber for benches. Children gathered kindling for the evening fires. The work carried the atmosphere of anticipated celebration, rare in a place where joy was rationed carefully against the certainty of winter. Not everyone shared the enthusiasm. Eliza Presnell, widow of one of the men involved in the Polk affair, expressed quiet reservations to her sister. She worried that outsiders brought scrutiny. The settlement had maintained its isolation deliberately, she reminded anyone who would listen. They answered to no sheriff, no county authority, no church hierarchy. They baptized their own children, buried their own dead, resolved their own disputes. Why invite someone to judge them? Her concerns were noted and dismissed. Hensley assured the families that Cord was not an agent of any institution. He came alone, asking nothing but the chance to preach. What harm could that bring? On September 19th, 2 days after Cord's departure from Banner's Elk, a boy named Thomas Hensley, Jacob's grandson, was sent down the trail to watch for the preacher's arrival. He returned at dusk, reporting no sign of anyone on the path. The families assumed Cord had underestimated the difficulty of the route, or had decided to make camp along the way, rather than arrive after dark. Mountain courtesy dictated patience. Thomas was sent again the next morning. This time he met Cord 3 miles out, leading the mule through a stretch where the trail narrowed to little more than a deer run. The preacher greeted the boy warmly, asked about his family, and inquired about the settlement's needs. Thomas, 10 years old and unused to strangers, answered in monosyllables. Cord did not press. They reached Raven Gap by midday on September 20th. The families gathered to meet him, forming a loose semicircle in the clearing. Cord introduced himself formally, thanked them for their hospitality, and asked where he might set up his tent. Hensley directed him to a spot near the creek, flat ground beneath a stand of hemlocks, close enough to be within shouting distance but far enough to offer privacy. Cord spent the afternoon erecting his tent with help from several men. The structure was larger than expected, big enough to shelter 30 people if they crowded. The canvas was weathered but sound, the poles cut from seasoned ash. Inside, he arranged a simple pulpit from stacked crates and placed his Bible atop it. He hung oil lamps from the center beam and laid straw on the ground for insulation. That evening, the families brought food: cornbread, beans, preserved apples, smoked pork. They ate together in the clearing while Cord talked about his ministry, the places he had preached, the souls he had helped bring to Christ. He asked about their lives, their struggles, their hopes. He listened more than he spoke, a quality that surprised them. Preachers, in their limited experience, tended toward monologue. As darkness fell and the meal concluded, Cord stood and announced that services would begin the following evening at sunset. He encouraged everyone to attend, but emphasized that participation was voluntary. He would preach, he said, only to those who wished to hear. With that, he retired to his tent. The families dispersed to their cabins, and the hollow settled into the kind of silence particular to mountain nights. Wind in the trees, water over stones, the occasional scream of a distant cat. What no one mentioned, not during the meal or after, was the feeling that had settled over the clearing once Cord arrived. Several people would later struggle to describe it. Not hostility exactly, but a sense of weight, as though the air itself had thickened. Children who normally ran and shouted played quietly. Dogs that typically followed visitors everywhere kept their distance from the tent, circling but never approaching. Eliza Presnell told her sister she felt watched, though by what or whom she could not say. The revival began on September 21st, 1875, at 6:30 in the evening. Families arrived as the sun dipped behind the western ridge, casting the hollow into shadow while the sky above still held light. Cord had lit the lamps inside the tent, and their glow made the canvas seem to pulse like something breathing. 32 people attended the first service. They filled the chairs and stood along the tent's perimeter. Cord welcomed them, his voice steady and warm. He led them in hymns, Amazing Grace, Rock of Ages, songs they knew, and the sound lifted into the trees with a clarity that surprised even those who sang regularly in their homes. Voices that spent most days calling across fields or coaxing livestock found harmony. Then Cord began to preach. He spoke about wilderness, about prophets who went into desolate places to hear God's voice, about communities that built their faith away from the corrupting influence of cities and institutions. He praised the families of Raven Gap for maintaining their independence, for preserving old ways, for choosing hardship over compromise. His words carried none of the condemnation mountain people had learned to expect from outsiders. Instead, he honored them. But then his tone shifted. He spoke about secrets, about sins hidden in the heart, buried like stones in soft ground. He quoted Matthew, "Nothing is covered that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known." He did not name specific transgressions, did not point fingers, but the words settled over the congregation with uncomfortable specificity. People shifted in their seats. A few glanced at neighbors. Cord pressed forward. He talked about the weight of guilt, the way it accumulated year by year until it became unbearable. He described forgiveness as a physical unburdening, something that could only happen through confession and repentance. His voice rose and fell with practiced rhythm, each sentence building pressure like water behind a dam. When he called for sinners to come forward, 3 people rose. The first was a young woman named Rebecca Whitlock, 19 years old, who wept as she confessed to stealing eggs from a neighbor and lying about it. Cord prayed over her, pronounced her forgiven, and sent her back to her seat in peace. The second was an older man, Samuel Green, who admitted to harboring anger toward his brother over an inheritance dispute. Cord counseled reconciliation and offered a blessing. The third was Eliza Presnell. She walked to the front slowly, her face set in an expression witnesses described as both resigned and defiant. She did not weep. She looked at Cord directly and said, "I need to confess something that weighs on my soul." The tent went silent. "My husband was one of the men who killed that surveyor. They made it look like a fall, but it was murder. I have carried that knowledge for 3 years, and it is destroying me." The air seemed to leave the tent. No one moved. Eliza continued, her voice steady. I am asking God's forgiveness. I am asking this community to witness my confession. I do not know what happens next, but I cannot live with this silence anymore. Cord placed a hand on her shoulder. He prayed over her for several minutes, asking for mercy, for peace, for courage. When he finished, Eliza returned to her seat. The congregation sat frozen. The men implicated by her confession, her husband had been dead 2 years, but others remained, stared at their hands, or concluded the service quickly after that. He offered a closing hymn and dismissed the gathering with a benediction. People left in silence, walking back to their cabins through darkness now complete. No one spoke. The weight that had arrived with Cord seemed to have doubled. In her cabin, Eliza sat by the fire and waited. She knew consequences would come. She had forced a reckoning. By morning, 2 families had packed their belongings and left Raven Gap. They would not return. The others remained, but the settlement's fragile cohesion had cracked. Jacob Hensley, the man who had invited Cord, sat on his porch through the night, watching the tense lamplight and wondering what he had brought into the hollow. The singing began that night. Hours after everyone had gone to bed, a voice rose from the direction of Cord's tent. Not hymns from the service, but something older. Words no one recognized, set to a melody that seemed to bypass the ear and settle directly into the chest. The sound carried across the hollow, penetrating cabin walls, reaching into sleep. Children woke crying. Adults lay awake, unable to name what they felt. By dawn, the singing had stopped, but everyone agreed on one thing. What they had heard was not entirely human. Silas Cord held services every evening for the next week. Attendance fluctuated. Some nights 20 people, others barely a dozen. But those who came found themselves caught in a pattern they could neither escape nor fully understand. Each service followed the same structure: hymns, sermon, altar call. And each night someone confessed something they had never intended to say aloud. A man admitted to beating his wife. Another confessed to fathering a child outside marriage and abandoning the mother. A woman spoke about poisoning her neighbor's hogs out of spite. The confessions grew darker, more specific, until the tent became a chamber where secrets bled out like pus from infected wounds. Cord received each admission with apparent compassion. He prayed, he counseled, he offered forgiveness in God's name. But he also began keeping a record. Several witnesses saw him writing in a leather journal late at night by lamplight, his hand moving steadily across the pages. When asked about it, he said he was documenting the movement of the Holy Spirit, creating a testament to God's work in the hollow. No one believed him. Jacob Hensley visited Cord on the 5th day of the revival, September 25th, and found the preacher sitting outside his tent reading his Bible. Hensley asked directly, "What was the purpose of these confessions? Why dredge up the past? Why force people to expose themselves?" Cord closed his Bible and looked at the older man with an expression Hensley later described as serene but terrible. "These mountains are poisoned," Cord said. "Not the land, but the people. Sin has accumulated here for generations, unpunished, unrepented. It has soaked into the soil. Every murder, every theft, every act of cruelty that went unanswered has left a stain. I am here to cleanse it." Hensley asked how. Cord smiled. "Through truth, through confession, through bringing everything hidden into the light. Only then can healing begin." Hensley left the conversation unsettled. That evening, he did not attend the service. Neither did several other families. The hollow was dividing between those who saw Cord as a prophet and those who saw him as something far more dangerous. Meanwhile, strange occurrences began accumulating like debts. Livestock refused to graze near the creek where Cord's tent stood. Chickens stopped laying. Milk curdled in the pail before it could be carried inside. A child fell into the water and emerged claiming something had held her under, not trying to drown her, but studying her, before releasing its grip. Her description was muddled: hands but not hands, cold but not wet, and her parents dismissed it as imagination. But the girl refused to go near the creek again. The singing continued each night, starting around midnight and lasting until just before dawn. The words remained unintelligible, but the melody stayed consistent, rising and falling in waves that seemed designed to unsettle rather than soothe. People began sleeping poorly, tempers shortened. Disputes that would normally be resolved with terse words escalated into shouting matches. On September 28th, a man named Luther Hicks confronted Cord publicly. Hicks was one of the men Eliza Presnell had implicated in the surveyor's murder. He had not attended any services, had in fact been vocal about his disdain for the revival. He found Cord by the creek washing clothes and demanded to know why the preacher was destroying the community. Cord listened without interruption, as Hicks accused him of being a provocateur, possibly an agent sent by the timber companies to destabilize the settlement so they could seize the land. When Hicks finished, Cord wrung out the shirt he had been washing and hung it on a low branch to dry. "I am not interested in your land," Cord said quietly. "I am interested in your souls. And right now, yours is so stained I can see it from here." Hicks struck him, a single blow to the jaw that dropped Cord to his knees. Blood ran from the preacher's mouth. He spat, looked up at Hicks, and smiled. "Striking a man of God," Cord said. "That will cost you." Hicks walked away, but that night he attended the service. Luther Hicks stood before the congregation on the evening of September 28th and confessed not just to helping kill the surveyor, but to having enjoyed it. He described in detail how they had lured Polk to the ravine, how they had argued first to make it seem like a confrontation, how Hicks himself had struck the killing blow with a mattock handle. He described the sound of the skull cracking, the way the body had twitched, the relief he felt knowing the land would remain undisturbed. Then he wept. Not quiet tears, but gasping sobs that shook his frame. Cord prayed over him for nearly 20 minutes, while the congregation watched in horrified fascination. When it ended, Hicks left the tent and was not seen in the hollow again. His wife found a note the next morning saying he had gone to Boone to turn himself in to the sheriff. He never arrived. The pattern accelerated after that. Each night, more confessions. A woman admitted to abandoning her first child in the woods because she could not feed it. A man spoke about burning a neighbor's barn over a property line dispute. Another woman confessed to conducting a long affair with her husband's brother, both men now dead. The revelations came faster, overlapping, until it seemed the entire settlement was imploding under the weight of accumulated guilt. And Cord wrote it all down. People noticed that the confessions never touched him personally. He elicited sin, recorded sin, pronounced forgiveness, but never admitted to any wrongdoing of his own. When asked about his past, he deflected with scripture or changed the subject. A few began to wonder, who was Silas Cord? What had brought him to these mountains? What did he gain from cataloging their failures? Research conducted years later by a seminary student in Kentucky would uncover fragments of Cord's background. He had indeed attended divinity school, but had been expelled for reasons the records carefully avoided specifying. A notation in the dean's log referenced theological deviations, and unorthodox practices during supervised ministry. A letter from a concerned professor mentioned Cord's obsession with confession as a form of power, his belief that extracting secrets granted spiritual authority. But in September of 1875, the families in Raven Gap knew none of this. On October 1st, the 10th day of the revival, Jacob Hensley decided to end it. He gathered several men, those who had not confessed, who still maintained their dignity, and they approached Cord's tent at midday. Hensley spoke for the group. "You need to leave. You are destroying this place. Pack your tent and go back to wherever you came from." Cord stood in the tent's entrance, backlit by the interior lamps so his face was shadowed. He was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying that peculiar resonance that made it seem to come from multiple directions at once. "I will leave when my work is complete, not before. You invited me here, Jacob Hensley. You asked me to bring the gospel to this hollow. I am doing exactly that. The gospel requires truth. Truth requires confession. Confession requires suffering. If you cannot endure this, then you were never truly saved to begin with." One of the men with Hensley, a farmer named David Potter, stepped forward. "We will force you out if necessary." Cord smiled. "You can try." They did not. Something in his tone, or perhaps just exhaustion, convinced them that violence would solve nothing. The men returned to their cabins. Hensley felt he had lost control of something fundamental. The settlement, his authority, perhaps his soul. That night's service was the largest yet. Nearly every adult in Raven Gap attended, drawn by a compulsion no one could later explain. Cord preached about judgment, about the winnowing of wheat from chaff, about communities that failed to purify themselves and were therefore destroyed by God's hand. His examples were biblical: Sodom, Gomorrah, the flood. But the implication was clear. Raven Gap stood on the edge of divine wrath. Then he did something new. He called for a collective confession. "Everyone here is guilty of something," he said. "Everyone has participated in the sins of this place, either directly or through silence. Those who knew about murders and said nothing. Those who witnessed theft and turned away. Those who benefited from crimes and asked no questions. You are all complicit. And unless you acknowledge that complicity, you will all suffer for it. What would you do sitting in that tent, knowing your neighbor's secrets, feeling the weight of your own? Would you stand and name your failures? Or would you remain silent and pray for dawn?" Most stood. The confessions that night were brief, formulaic, almost ritualistic. People spoke their names and admitted to knowing about crimes without reporting them, to ignoring suffering when intervention would have cost them socially or economically, to choosing comfort over justice. Cord blessed each one. By the time the service ended, nearly the entire congregation had participated. Only 3 people had remained seated throughout: Jacob Hensley, Eliza Presnell, and a young man named Isaiah Gregg, who had arrived in Raven Gap 6 months earlier and kept to himself. Cord looked at them as the others filed out. He said nothing. He did not need to. The message was clear. They were marked. On October 3rd, a writer reached Boone with a message from Raven Gap. The note, written in Jacob Hensley's careful hand, requested that Sheriff Thomas Dula investigate disturbances at the settlement related to a traveling preacher who was causing unrest. The message was deliberately vague, avoiding specific accusations but conveying urgency. Dula was 52, a Mexican war veteran who had served as sheriff of Watauga County for 8 years. He was known for fairness tempered with pragmatism. The mountains bred disputes that official law could not always resolve. His role was to intervene when violence seemed imminent and otherwise let communities govern themselves. Hensley's message troubled him because the old man rarely asked for help. Dula assembled a small party: himself, his deputy William Farthing, and 2 locals who knew the trail to Raven Gap. They departed Boone on the morning of October 4th, expecting to reach the hollow by evening. The journey required careful navigation. Autumn rains had made the path treacherous, and the group moved slowly to avoid injury to horses. They arrived at dusk on October 5th to find Raven Gap in a state of eerie calm. Smoke rose from cabin chimneys. Livestock grazed in pens, but no one was visible. No children played, no adults worked. The settlement appeared functional but abandoned. Dula called out, identifying himself. After a long pause, Jacob Hensley emerged from his cabin. The old man looked haggard, as though he had not slept in days. He greeted the sheriff with obvious relief and led the party to his home, where his daughter-in-law prepared a meal while Hensley explained the situation. He described Cord's arrival, the revival services, the escalating confessions, the division within the community. He mentioned the singing at night, though he struggled to articulate why it bothered him. Sounds were just sounds, but these particular sounds made him feel as though something was watching him, waiting for him to slip. Dula asked where the preacher was now. Hensley pointed toward the creek. Cord had not left his tent in 2 days, Hensley said. People brought him food and water, but he refused visitors. The services had stopped on October 3rd, the night after the collective confession. Since then, silence, except for the singing after dark. Dula decided to visit the tent immediately. He and Farthing walked to the creek as the last light faded from the sky. The tent was visible through the trees, lamps burning inside. Dula called out a greeting. No response. They approached cautiously. The canvas walls rippled in the breeze. Through the gaps, they could see the interior. The makeshift pulpit, the chairs arranged in rows, the Bible still open on its stand. But no preacher. Dula opened the tent flap and stepped inside. Farthing followed. The space was empty. Cord's personal belongings, his satchel, his coat, his journal, were all present. His coat, they noted, hung from the center pole. Its pockets sagged with weight. Dula checked them and found creek stones, smooth and round, several pounds worth in each pocket. Farthing examined the Bible. It was open to Revelations, chapter 6, the passage about the 4 horsemen. One verse was underlined heavily, the marking so deep it had torn through the thin paper. And I looked, and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. The underlining was not ink or pencil. It was brown, organic, and when Farthing touched it, it flaked like dried blood. Dula searched the tent thoroughly. No signs of violence. No indication that Cord had left suddenly or under duress. His boots were still there, positioned neatly beside the cot, as though he had stepped out of them and walked away barefoot. Outside, the search expanded. Dula organized the men from Boone and recruited several from Raven Gap to comb the area. They searched until midnight, looking for tracks, clothing, any trace of the preacher. They found nothing. At dawn, they resumed. Still nothing. By midday on October 6th, Dula concluded that Silas Cord had either been murdered and his body hidden with extraordinary care, or he had vanished in a manner that defied logical explanation. Both possibilities were unsettling. He interviewed everyone in the settlement. The stories were consistent. Cord had been seen entering his tent on the evening of October 3rd after dismissing a woman who had brought him supper. No one had seen him emerge. The singing had started at midnight, as usual, but some witnesses claimed it sounded different that night. Multiple voices instead of one, harmonizing in a way that made their skin crawl. By morning, silence. Doula examined Cord's journal. The entries documented confessions in meticulous detail, each person's name and sin recorded in tight script. The final entry, dated October 3rd, read simply, "The work is complete. The wheat has been separated from the chaff. Tomorrow, the harvest." What did that mean? Doula pressed Hensley and others for context. No one could explain it. Cord had spoken often about judgment and purification, but never in terms that suggested specific action. Farthing, examining the creek bank, found something peculiar. A series of footprints leading into the water, but not emerging on the other side. They were barefoot prints, the right size for Cord. They entered the creek at a shallow ford and simply ended. The water was barely knee-deep. A person could not drown there unless held down deliberately. But there were no signs of struggle, no disturbed stones, no mud kicked up. Just footprints that walked into water and disappeared. Sheriff Doula remained in Raven Gap for 3 days, conducting a thorough investigation. He questioned each family multiple times, looking for inconsistencies. He searched the surrounding forest for evidence of a body or a camp where Cord might be hiding. He examined every cabin for signs that someone was sheltering the preacher. He found nothing that advanced his understanding. On October 9th, he returned to Boone and filed a report with the county court. The document, preserved in county records, lists Silas Cord as a missing person, last seen on October 3rd, 1875. It notes the unusual circumstances, the abandoned tent, the weighted coat, the footprints into the creek, and recommends that the case remain open pending further information. No foul play was officially suspected, though Doula's private notes, discovered decades later, reveal his belief that the settlement knew more than they admitted. After Doula's departure, Raven Gap fell into a pattern of slow disintegration. The confessions extracted during the revival had destroyed the social fabric that held the community together. People who had lived side by side for generations now avoided each other. Families stopped sharing labor. Disputes that would have been mediated by elders went unresolved. Jacob Hensley, who had invited Cord in the first place, became a pariah. People blamed him for bringing destruction into the hollow. His own family began to distance themselves. By November, his daughter-in-law and grandchildren moved to her parents' home in Blowing Rock. Hensley remained alone in his cabin, tending his small plot, speaking to no one. Eliza Presnell, the first to confess, experienced a different fate. Her admission had freed her from the weight of guilt, but it had also marked her as a traitor to the settlement's code of silence. 3 families associated with the men involved in the surveyor's murder made it clear she was no longer welcome. She left in early November, moving to Tennessee to live with distant relatives. Before departing, she told her sister that the worst part was not the ostracism, but the certainty that she had been used, that Cord had extracted her confession not to cleanse her soul, but to break the community. Isaiah Gregg, the young man who had refused to participate in the collective confession, disappeared in mid-October. His cabin was found empty, his belongings undisturbed, no note left behind. Some speculated he had simply moved on, as young men often did. Others whispered that he knew something about Cord's disappearance and had been silenced. No evidence supported either theory. By December, only 7 families remained in Raven Gap. The others had scattered to relatives, to other hollows, to towns where anonymity offered a fresh start. The revival had accomplished what no external force could. It had destroyed the settlement from within. And still, the singing continued. Through October and into November, residents of Raven Gap, and even those who had moved away, reported hearing singing on certain nights. It came from the direction of the creek, from the place where Cord's tent had stood. The tent itself had been taken down and burned on Sheriff Dula's recommendation. He thought removing the physical reminder might ease tensions. But the sounds persisted. The singing followed a pattern. It began at midnight or shortly after. It lasted between 1 and 3 hours. It was loudest during storms, when rain and wind should have drowned out any human voice. Yet somehow the melody cut through the weather with unnatural clarity. And it was always the same. A hymn in a minor key, words almost intelligible but never quite. Like a language remembered from childhood but lost to time. Those who heard it described physical responses. Hair standing on end, nausea, a feeling of profound wrongness that persisted for hours afterward. Dogs howled. Livestock panicked. Children woke screaming from nightmares they could not describe. Jacob Hensley, still living alone in his cabin, decided to investigate. On the night of November 14th, when the singing began, he lit a lantern and walked to the creek. He later wrote an account of what happened in a letter to his son, a document preserved in family records. He reached the clearing where the tent had stood and found it empty. The singing was loud, impossibly loud, as though a choir stood invisible around him. He called out, asking who was there. The singing stopped instantly. Silence so complete that Hensley could hear his own heartbeat. Then a voice spoke. Not from any particular direction, but from everywhere at once, including inside his own skull. You were judged and found wanting. You stood by while others sinned. You profited from their crimes. You invited me here, Jacob Hensley, and now you must live with what you summoned. Hensley ran. He reached his cabin, barred the door, and sat awake until dawn. When the sun rose, he packed what he could carry and left Raven Gap forever. He died 3 years later in Wilkes County, never returning to the mountains. A traveling preacher, not Cord, but a Methodist circuit rider named Talbot, passed through the area in December of 1875 and heard about the singing. Curious, he asked permission to spend a night in the hollow. The few remaining families tried to dissuade him, but Talbot insisted. He was a man of God. What could harm him? He set up camp near the creek on December 8th. The singing began at midnight. Talbot tried to join in, adding his own voice to the hymn. Later, he wrote in his journal that this was a mistake. The moment he sang, the other voice, the primary voice, shifted. It matched his pitch exactly, then began to harmonize with itself, creating chords that should not be possible from a single throat. Talbot stopped singing. The other voice continued. Then it spoke his name. Not asking, not questioning, but stating it with perfect knowledge. Richard Talbot. Born 1832 in Virginia. Seminary graduate 1854. You abandoned your first congregation after 6 months because you slept with a parishioner's wife and feared discovery. You took a new circuit under a false name. You have spent 21 years lying about who you are. Talbot left before dawn. His journal entry ends with a single line. That was not a man singing. That was not a man at all. In January of 1876, a journalist from Raleigh named Harrison Polk, nephew of the surveyor killed 3 years earlier, arrived in Watauga County. He had heard rumors about the strange events in Raven Gap and wanted to investigate both his uncle's death and the preacher's disappearance. He believed the two incidents were connected, that Cord had been murdered in retaliation for forcing confessions about the surveyor's killing. Polk spent 2 weeks in the area, interviewing anyone who would speak with him. He visited the hollow and documented the abandoned cabins, the silent clearing, the creek where Cord's footprints ended. He collected testimony about the revival, the confessions, and the singing. His notes, preserved in the North Carolina collection at the University of North Carolina, form the most comprehensive contemporary account of the events. He also did something no one else had. He investigated Silas Cord's background systematically. Through correspondence with churches and seminaries across the South, Polk traced Cord's movements over the previous decade. What he found disturbed him. Cord had conducted similar revivals in at least 4 other isolated communities between 1865 and 1875. In each case, the pattern was identical: arrival, tent meetings, escalating confessions, mysterious disappearance. In each case, the community involved had subsequently collapsed or dispersed. Families moved away. Social structures disintegrated. And in each case, people reported hearing singing long after Cord vanished. One community in Kentucky had experienced an additional detail. 6 months after Cord's disappearance, a surveyor for a coal company arrived and found the land abandoned. The company purchased the acreage at auction and began strip mining operations. A similar sequence had occurred in Tennessee, where timber interests acquired formerly occupied land. Polk developed a theory. Cord was an agent for resource extraction companies, sent to destabilize communities so their land could be seized cheaply. The revival was a weapon. Confession was its mechanism. By forcing people to expose themselves, Cord destroyed the trust and cohesion necessary for collective resistance. Then he disappeared, leaving the community to collapse under the weight of its own revealed sins. It was a compelling theory. Polk published his findings in a series of articles for the Raleigh Observer. The pieces generated considerable discussion, but no concrete action. No company admitted to employing Cord. No legal mechanism existed to prosecute someone for psychological manipulation, even if he could be found. And Cord remained missing. Polk returned to Raven Gap in February, determined to find physical evidence. He hired 2 men from Banner's Elk to help him search the area around the creek, where Cord's tent had stood. They dug in locations where the ground appeared disturbed. They dragged the deeper pools downstream. They climbed the surrounding ridges looking for hidden graves. On February 26, 1876, they found something. A quarter-mile upstream from where Cord's tent had stood, the creek passed through a narrow gorge. Laurel thickets choked the banks, and most locals avoided the area because the footing was treacherous. Polk and his hired men pushed through anyway, following a hunch that if someone had wanted to hide a body, this would be ideal terrain. They found a small cave entrance halfway up the gorge's north wall, concealed behind a curtain of rhododendron. The opening was barely large enough to crawl through, but it widened into a chamber about 15 feet across. Inside, someone had created a makeshift living space. There was a bedroll, neatly folded, a tin cup and plate. 3 candle stubs melted onto flat stones, and covering the walls, scratched into the limestone with what appeared to be a nail or blade, were words. Hundreds of words. Thousands. Names and sins, copied from Cord's journal, covering every available surface. The writing was frantic, overlapping, compressed into margins and corners. Reading it required a lantern held close, but the content was unmistakable. This was the congregation's confessions, transcribed obsessively. In the center of the chamber floor, arranged in a perfect circle, were 23 creek stones. Polk counted them twice to be sure. 23 stones, each one approximately the size of a man's fist, each one chosen for smoothness and symmetry. They formed a circle about 4 feet in diameter. Inside the circle, scratched into the cave floor, was a single word: finished. There was no body, no clothing, no sign that anyone had been there recently. But the cave felt inhabited, as though whoever created this shrine might return at any moment. Polk asked his hired men if they had heard singing near the gorge. Both nodded. One said he had avoided this stretch of the creek for months because of sounds that came from the rocks themselves. Not quite singing, but something like it. A vibration that made his teeth ache. They photographed the cave using a primitive camera Polk had brought from Raleigh. The images captured the inscriptions on the walls, the circle of stones, the austere living arrangements. Polk carefully transcribed several passages from the walls into his notebook. Then they left, sealing the entrance behind them with branches to discourage others from entering. Polk's articles about the cave generated even more attention than his earlier pieces. Scholars debated what the discovery meant. Had Cord hidden there after abandoning his tent? If so, why inscribe confessions on stone? Was it obsession or documentation or something else entirely? And where had he gone afterward? Among those who read Polk's articles was a professor of theology at Davidson College named Everett Marsh. Marsh had studied fringe religious movements and was familiar with sects that used confession as a form of control. He wrote to Polk proposing a meeting. They convened in Boone in March of 1876. Marsh offered a different interpretation of events. He suggested that Cord was not working for mining companies, but for himself. Specifically, Marsh theorized that Cord believed he could absolve sin through forced confession, and that by extracting and recording every secret in a community, he gained spiritual power over that community. The cave inscriptions, Marsh argued, were not documentation, but ritual. Cord had been attempting to create what certain mystical traditions called a sin vessel, a physical location where collective guilt could be contained and neutralized. The stones in the circle represented individual souls. By writing their sins on the walls and enclosing them within the circle, Cord believed he was trapping the evil and purifying the people. But something had gone wrong. The process required the confessor to remain pure, untainted by the sins he absorbed. Marsh suspected that Cord had succumbed to the weight of what he carried. The cave had become not a vessel for sin, but a prison for the one who tried to contain it. Polk was skeptical. What about the singing? What about the footprints into the creek? What about the multiple communities where Cord had enacted the same pattern? Marsh did not have answers. He acknowledged the gaps in his theory, but he insisted that Cord's motivations were spiritual, not economic. The man was a zealot, possibly insane, certainly dangerous. And if Marsh's theory was correct, then Cord was likely dead, destroyed by the very forces he tried to harness. The two men agreed to disagree. Polk continued investigating the mining company angle. Marsh returned to Davidson to write an academic paper on the case. Neither would solve the mystery, but both contributed pieces that future researchers would reference. In April of 1876, a woman named Catherine Bell contacted Harrison Polk. She had read his articles and wanted to share information about Silas Cord. Bell lived in Asheville and worked as a schoolteacher. She had known Cord before he became a traveling preacher. They met at her home on April 15th. Bell was 62 years old, articulate and visibly uncomfortable discussing the subject. But she felt compelled, she said, to provide context that might help Polk understand what had happened in Raven Gap. Bell had known Cord in Kentucky in the 1850s when he was a seminary student. They were not romantically involved, but they moved in the same social circles. She described him as brilliant, charismatic, and troubled. He had grown up in a strict religious household where his father, a Baptist minister, used confession as a tool of domination. Every Sunday, the family confessed their sins to the father, who kept records and used them to manipulate and punish. Cord had rebelled against this, leaving home at 16. But he carried the pattern with him. At seminary, he became obsessed with the mechanics of confession, how it worked psychologically, what it revealed about human nature, whether it genuinely absolved guilt or simply transferred it from one person to another. He began conducting unauthorized experiments. He would befriend fellow students, gain their trust, and elicit confessions. Then he would use those confessions to control them. Subtle manipulations, suggestions, social pressure. Several students complained. The seminary investigated and expelled Cord in his final year. Bell lost track of him after that. She heard rumors that he had started a small church in Tennessee and been driven out after parishioners accused him of blackmail. That he had worked as a traveling preacher, always moving, never staying long enough for people to recognize the pattern. That he had become increasingly convinced he was doing God's work. That extraction of sin was a holy calling. She never saw him again. But when she read Polk's articles, she recognized the method. Cord had simply refined his technique over 20 years, targeting isolated communities where no one could stop him. Bell said something else that stayed with Polk for the rest of his life. She believed Cord was still alive, not in any conventional sense, but alive nonetheless. She thought he had found a way to embed himself in the places he worked, through the confessions he extracted, the sins he recorded, the people he manipulated. He had become part of the landscape, part of the memory, part of the ongoing trauma. And as long as people remembered Raven Gap, as long as they told stories about the revival and the singing, Cord persisted. Polk asked if she meant this metaphorically or literally. Bell smiled sadly and said she was no longer sure there was a difference. By the summer of 1876, Raven Gap was abandoned. The last two families left in June, unable to endure another winter in a place that felt cursed. Their cabins stood empty, doors swinging open in the wind. Gardens returned to forest. Fences collapsed. Within 5 years, the settlement was unrecognizable. Timber companies did eventually acquire the land, though not through the nefarious schemes Polk suspected. The property simply went to auction for unpaid taxes, and a mill consortium bought it cheaply. They clear-cut the ridges in the 1880s, built a narrow-gauge railway to haul logs, and abandoned the operation when the chestnut blight destroyed the most valuable trees in the 1910s. The hollow returned to wilderness. The creek still runs through it. The clearing where Cord's tent stood is grown over with brush. The cave where he inscribed confessions on the walls was sealed by a rockfall in the 1920s and has not been reopened. But people still hear the singing. Reports come sporadically, separated by years or decades. A hiker camping near the creek wakes at midnight to hear hymns in an old-fashioned style. A hunter following a deer trail loses his bearings when a voice starts singing just out of sight. A researcher investigating Appalachian folklore records audio in the gorge and captures, beneath the white noise, something rhythmic and melodic. The pattern is consistent. The singing occurs at night, usually in poor weather. It is always a single voice, though sometimes it harmonizes with itself in ways that sound like multiple singers. The words are almost intelligible, but never quite. and everyone who hears it agrees on one thing. It does not sound entirely human. What happened to Silas Cord? The question has no definitive answer. Some believe he drowned in the creek, his body swept downstream and buried in silt. Others think he was murdered by someone in Raven Gap, Luther Hicks or another man implicated in confessions, and the body hidden so well it has never been found. A few entertain the possibility that he simply walked away, abandoning his tent and belongings, and started a new life somewhere far from the mountains. And some believe he is still there, not as a man, but as something that has become part of the hollow itself. They point to the singing, to the way certain places feel wrong even now, to the persistence of his influence despite the passage of 150 years. They suggest that Cord achieved what he sought, not purification of the community, but a kind of immortality through trauma. The confessions he extracted, the sins he recorded, the secrets he forced into daylight. These things altered the people involved so fundamentally that echoes remain. Not in any supernatural sense, but in the way families remember stories, in the way guilt accumulates across generations, in the way some places carry history like stones in their pockets. Raven Gap exists now only on old maps. The trail that once led there is overgrown. The families who lived there scattered so completely that few of their descendants know the connection. But the name persists in local folklore as a cautionary tale, a place where a preacher came and destroyed a community by making them tell the truth. The irony is deliberate. Truth was supposed to be liberating. Confession was meant to absolve. But Cord demonstrated that truth weaponized becomes oppression, and confession extracted through coercion leaves wounds that never fully heal. Harrison Polk continued investigating the case until his death in 1911. His papers, donated to the university, include hundreds of pages of notes, interviews, and theories. He never reached a conclusion he found satisfying. In his final letter to Professor Marsh, written 3 months before a stroke killed him, Polk admitted that he had come to believe some mysteries were not meant to be solved. That certain events exceed rational explanation, not because they are supernatural, but because they reveal aspects of human nature too dark and complex to reduce to simple narrative. He wrote, "I no longer care whether Silas Cord drowned or ran or was murdered. What matters is that he succeeded. He wanted to break a community, and he did. He wanted to prove that secrets could destroy, and they did. He wanted to demonstrate the power of forced confession, and he demonstrated it thoroughly. If his goal was to leave a scar on those mountains, then he won. The scar is still there." In 2008, a graduate student in folklore studies at Appalachian State University named Jennifer Vance conducted fieldwork in Watauga County. She was documenting regional ghost stories and kept encountering references to Raven Gap. Multiple informants, all elderly, mentioned it as a place to avoid. When pressed for details, they offered vague warnings about singing in the woods and a preacher who disappeared. Vance decided to visit. She found the location using old survey maps and GPS. The walk took her most of a day, following game trails and compass bearings. She reached the hollow at dusk and made camp near the creek. At midnight, she woke to singing. Her recording equipment captured 17 minutes of audio before the batteries died. The file has been analyzed by musicologists, linguists, and audio forensics experts. The singing is clearly audible, a male voice performing a hymn with no identifiable words. Spectrographic analysis shows harmonic structures that do not match human vocal anatomy, multiple fundamental frequencies layered in ways that require either digital manipulation or an impossible throat configuration. Vance submitted the recording as part of her thesis. It generated brief academic interest, then faded from discussion. The file is available online for anyone who wants to listen. Most who do report feeling unsettled, though they cannot articulate why. She never returned to Raven Gap. When asked why, she said simply, "Because whatever is singing there doesn't need an audience." The hollow remains empty. The creek still cuts through stone. And on certain nights, October nights especially, when the wind comes cold from the north and the sky holds no moon, the sound of a man's voice rises from the ridgeline, singing hymns in a key that makes no sense. Words that almost form meaning before dissolving into static and silence. And those who hear it remember that in 1875, a preacher named Silas Cord entered those mountains carrying a Bible and a tent, promising salvation, delivering only revelation, that the darkest truths are the ones we tell about ourselves. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.